One really interesting question we got from Lydia Ostepe earlier this morning.
Yep.
Is there any connection between Boy Breaking Glass and Williams's Between Walls?
Okay. Ambrose, do you want to read that? Would you be willing to read that poem, Boy Breaking Glass, if you have the text? I have the text.
Yeah. Yes, I have it here.
So let's all think of Between Walls while Amber Rose is reading this poem.
Boy Breaking Glass by Gwendolyn Brooks. Whose broken window is a cry of art, success that winks aware as elegance, as a treasonable faith, is raw, is sonic, is old-eyed premiere, our beautiful flaw and terrible ornament, our barbarous and metal little man. I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration, full of pepper and light and salt and night and cargoes. Don't go down the plank if you see there's no extension. Each to his grief, each to his loneliness and fidgety revenge. Nobody knew where I was, and now I am no longer there. The only sanity is a cup of tea. The music is in minors. Each one other is having different weather. It was you. It was you who threw away my name, and this is everything I have for me. Who has not Congress, lobster, love, luau, the Regency Room, the Statue of Liberty runs, a sloppy amalgamation, a mistake, a cliff, a hymn, a snare, and an exceeding sun.
Whoa. So I mean, we should talk about the poem, but I guess let's follow Lydia's question. How might that connect us to the strategy of Between Walls? Anyone have an idea about that? Anna, would you start, and then I'm going to throw it over to Erica Kaufman to see if she has an idea, and we have a phone call, so we'll get to that next. Is there a connection? I mean, obviously there's a lot of differences.
Yeah, a lot of differences. But I suppose in both poems there's an interest in what is typically overlooked or underseen or underappreciated, maybe. Mm-hmm. Both poems are sort of seeking to make those the subject of poetry.
Mm-hmm. That is one really great parallel. Erica, can you think of another connection between the two?
I think that they're doing this in very different ways, but there's a lot of attention paid to the line and how the line is working as a unit. In the Brooks, you have a lot of the end stops, like a lot of lines that end with periods.
Yeah.
And, the Williams is the Williams lack of punctuation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'll throw one out, and then I think we should just talk about Boy Breaking Glass for a little bit on its own. The thing I like about the Williams poem is what Anna said. Williams wants to see in places that we forgot to see, that artists think are not worth looking at. These are abandoned places. They're typically urban places that everybody thinks are ugly, and Williams has this project of wanting to restore to beauty things that people normally think of as not beautiful. In the spirit of the kind of modernism I admire, which is anything can be the subject of a poem, anything can be the subject of art, no matter how low. And it ends with the shining, a positive term, among cinders, which is burnt out, negative, death, pieces of a green bottle that had been broken. Somebody broke that bottle. Somebody discarded it, or at the back wings of the hospital, somebody from the upper floor of the hospital flung a bottle, or it just got dropped on the way to the garbage. And this poem is radical in that the poet is seeing something shine, and it's a fragment. What Brooks does is take it definitely to the next level by starting with the assumption that there is an aesthetic, a positive aesthetic to the broken windows theory of urban policing, I guess you could say, that this that this boy, in Williams, the boy doesn't exist. It's just whatever happened much earlier, and he doesn't even try to imagine the life and art of the person who broke the glass. And Gwendolyn Brooks begins where that poem ends by thinking, okay, whose broken window is a cry of art? So it's like starting where Williams left off. So thank you, Lydia, for the question. Who wants to talk about this poem? Lily, you want to say something about this poem by Brooks?
Yeah, I think I know we don't have to keep talking about the connection or putting it in conversation with the Williams poem, but a huge something that just made me see or think about is that poem is very interested in a more objective look. There's like just the scene, the speaker almost disappears. We don't necessarily know he's there, except that we know he's looking at the glass, but that's not really part of the poem. Whereas here we have explicit pronouns like our beautiful flaw, our barbarous and metal little man. So I think Brooks is making a very strong positioning her own self very strongly with the poem. She's not just framing something for us to look at differently. She's very actively interjecting, like, this is our person and we need to take care of him maybe, or this is a scene that includes us and we are being called to do something, as opposed to like we're on a smoke break in the hospital looking at something.
Right. Great. I want to ask a question about that poem. I'm going to ask Jamie, would you give Hannah the mic? The mic's right over there. Sorry, Hannah. And I wonder if Dave Poplar would also answer this question, and maybe Amber Rose wants to join it too. In what way does Gwendolyn Brooks, what sort of strategy as a poet of this poem, linguistic, structural, whatever, what in the poem, the way the poem is written, signals her affinity for, her empathy for this boy who is breaking glass and wanting it to be counted as an expression, as human expression? Is there any indication in the form, not in the content of the poem, that Brooks is on the side of this boy? So I want to start with Hannah, then go to Dave, and then maybe Amber Rose. Hi, Hannah.
Hi. That's a great question. I think that what signals this to me right away is the fact that the title doesn't stand by itself. It's what leads us into the work, and that's where we meet the boy breaking glass. So right away, formally, the title, foregrounds this boy, and we know that every part of the rest of the poem, all of its content pertains to him.
Great. Fabulous. Dave Poplar, any thoughts on how this poem is written?
I love this poem too. It really gives me the impression of playing with negative space, and that's very similar to what we're dealing with Between Walls. We're talking about negative space. That's all that's there, but there's still some desperate attempt or urge or drive to make something substantive out of this negative space. And this boy in Boy Breaking Glass, I shall create, if not a note, a whole. Not an overture, a desecration. We're talking about trying to use negative space because that's all that he has to make something. The poem, the form of it's not very standard, and it's almost as if the stanzas are shards in and of itself. So in that way, you could even read the poem as almost like an homage to broken shards of glass, another form of art made out of that desecration itself. So you could look at it that way.
That was really well said, Dave. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration. If I'm going to do that, and if the poem that contains me or that describes me by Brooks is going to do that, then her own work needs to align with me by creating fragments rather than wholes, by creating desecrations rather than overtures. And the poem beautifully falls apart isn't the right phrase, but beautifully goes all over the place, including alliteratively, lobster, love, luau. We're just all over the place, and she's doing it almost in homage to this negative desecration. Anyway, Amber Rose, a thought on this?
Yeah, I have two thoughts to add to the great comments that we had already. The first is that this is one of the few poems, maybe the only poem this week, that has a quotation that has the subject speaking in it. And it's not, so throughout the poem, Brooks's voice is aligned, but she actually creates space in the poem for the subject to speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And if you think that somebody else might be, who might have seen this boy potentially would have said, this is a vandal, part of the, so much of that naming is also a silencing and taking them out of the conversation and not allowing that person to speak forth. But Gwendolyn Brooks puts her voice right alongside the voice of the boy, which is really powerful. And then the other thing that I wanted to draw attention to is that parenthetical right after the first line. It's almost as if the poem, by including that parenthetical formally, the poem is responding to whoever might read that first line and want to check out and say, broken windows, that's not art. Like, already, before you even get into the rest of the poem, formally there's a response in that parenthetical that I think is really powerful.
Yeah. Gwendolyn Brooks, people, doesn't really get much better. And Ray Maxwell is tweeting, "Ooh, deep plunge into Boy Breaking Glass." Like, yeah, there's a lot of Brooks fans out there. And I just want to say before we switch to the person on the phone is that Brooks is thought of in Chicago when she was doing her thing as one of the most important poets of that city. There was a lot of decorum about her. She treated everybody with sort of old-fashioned respect. She was a proper person. She was very polite, very generous. But by the time she writes this poem, she's all those things, and yet at the same time, she's saying, don't assume that a boy breaking a window is a criminal, is a scoundrel, is a thug. Let us take the side of vandals because they might be saying something. And saying something, the way they say it, is a cry for art, not a cry for help, a cry for art. They're expressing themselves, and this gets to count. And I'm expressing solidarity with me by writing a poem like this, which all of my fans thought, what, Gwen, what are you doing? This is crazy. And I think that craziness is so aligned with the kid is teaching her. This kid who's like 2 generations behind her, amazing person, amazing citizen.